right, how's everybody doing today? Time to talk some pond fishing springtime tips. Unlike probably any of the other ones that we've done of these Ask an Angler thus far, this one's relevant today. So that's pretty exciting. Everything we're going to talk about, you can go out to a pond this evening, this afternoon, and all this stuff is going to be right in the wheelhouse. So to kick this off, we're going to talk about 4 species. So if you fish your own pond or you got a pond that has some, different types of fish in it, we're going to be covering sunfish, crappie, channel catfish, and largemouth bass. Those are pretty much your 4 staple fish in farm ponds, city ponds, small lakes, all across the state. So we'll get kicked off. I'm just going to kind of go through and show you guys my setups. We'll just go through each tackle box and kind of discuss what's in it, how to use it for what species and what. There's 2 different types of pond fishing. Obviously one is on the bank, and then another would be being able to get on the water. If you have a private pond, if you have a pond in your neighborhood, some city ponds and lakes allow for kayaks or canoes. It's a great option. Everything that we're going to talk about today can be used from the bank so that it includes everybody. But being able to deploy some of these tactics from the water itself will ultimately probably result in you being able to catch more fish. There's just certain spots on bodies of water, especially with laydowns and things like that, where casting from the bank is kind of working against you because you're fishing uphill. So when you can get out on the water in a kayak or a canoe or a float tube or, whatever, small boat, being able to fish shallow out to deeper water, you're just going to be able to get into more fish that you can't get to from the bank. But all of this stuff, you can catch any of those fish. You're just probably going to end up getting hung up a little bit more, but that's fine. That's part of fishing. If you're not getting hung up, you're not fishing hard enough. So we'll kick it off. We'll go with sunfish and crappie. Not as much gear for that, not as many options for what's going to work in your ponds. But I got 3 boxes for my small game in pond. So this is the first box. Basically, the only thing out of here is just going to be these tubes right here in the front. If you've listened to any of these courses in the past, you've watched any of our videos or read any of my articles, you will hear me being a huge advocate of small tubes are just, I don't know what it is. I've thrown just about everything that you can possibly throw at fish all across the state. And there's something about these stupid little tubes in this color that just outfish everything else. Part of pond fishing is really about the subtleties of fishing, finesse techniques. While there are some ponds where you can, run a crankbait through, you can run a spinnerbait through and pick up bass. Usually that window is pretty short. We're kind of in it right now. If you go to your local pond, all of our bass are going to be in pre-spawn mode. They should be feeding pretty heavily right now. They should be fairly easy to catch in most locations. And this is the time of year where, a rattle trap, lipless crankbait, lip crankbait, jerk baits, spinner baits, big profile power fishing baits will work at this time of year. I just don't use them in ponds. They're easy to get hung up on. They're expensive. So every time, if you're not out in a kayak or a float where you can, dig your rod down and get yourself out of trouble, it's not fun losing $10 baits in a pond. So most of the stuff that I have here today is all basically small, soft plastic. I have a couple of jigs. That's pretty much the only thing that I'll use in a pond. But like I said, this time of year, you want to use those power type fishing baits like crankbaits. Those are going to work right now for largemouth bass. They're just in that mode where you can fish fast. You can kind of throw everything at them. But I want this to cover the entire year. You should be able to go to a pond any day of the year, any weather condition with these tactics and be able to catch fish. Even on the hardest fishing days, the things that we're going to go over, especially these little tubes, this is going to catch you fish in the middle of December and it's going to catch fish on the hottest day in July. So with that, these are rigged with, I rig them with 1/32 ounce. I can cast that with my little microlight rods. If you're having trouble, if you're getting bird's nest, if you're not using a spin casting rod or a bait casting rod and you're using an open face spinning reel, probably want to elect for a 16th ounce to start until you get the hang of these things because they are very light. And even with 4-pound test, you're occasionally just going to throw it too hard with not enough backbone on the rod and all that line's going to pop off. But They're internally rigged. So this is a Crappie Max. It's a Bass Pro brand. It's green pumpkin with red and black flake. I use this, and this is pretty much what all my pond rods are rigged up with in one of 3 sizes, and it's what I take to every creek and stream in Oklahoma. Very rarely deviate from just fishing with these. But they come with a Bass Pro red hook squirt head that are made for these. And why I like these better than, say, a typical like round head jig is that this covers the entire body when it's inside. So when this is in there and the body, as you can see, that whole piece of lead goes all the way down to where my skirt's at. So what that means is when a fish bites it, you don't have open air in there, so they can't do as much damage to the plastic. Because the only knock on fishing with internally weighted tubes is you have to physically cut them off to retie on. You can't, it's not like running a jig head where you have a soft plastic attached to the back. Tail gets ripped off, it gets bit in half, you just pull it off, replace it. Every time you have to retie on with these internally weighted tubes. So if there is a knock on them, that's what it is. But if you're going to use something, try to use lead weights that have it all the way through the body when you're using tubes. You'd be amazed. You catch 20, 25 fish on the same lure before you got to change the plastic. Whereas if this had just a normal round head on it, you might lose it after the first fish, but you're probably going to lose it within the first 5. So green pumpkin, red and black flake. Doesn't have to be a tube. It could be a small worm, small lizard, small creature bait, but this is your color. Any pond in Oklahoma, this is going to be your primary focus color. This is going to mimic a plethora of what's in your ponds. Every pond's going to be different. Some are going to have crawfish in them. Some of them aren't. Some of them are going to have golden shiners in them. Some of them are going to have mosquito fish. Some of them might have shad. So your forage base is different in every pond. But this is your all-around winner of a color, is a green pumpkin with that red and black flake in it. This will catch sunfish, crappie, bass, and catfish. Probably only going to get into catfish if you're really loaded up on like 1 to 2 pound channels. If you only got, a dozen or so bigger fish that are swimming around, we'll get in how to get after them. You very rarely catch them on artificials because there's so many sunfish, crappie, and bass they're going to get to this. So to weight, they're obviously hollow, and right there, it's an open deal. So you start with the eyelid and just thread that right into that hole, and then just work the plastic up and over. And then it comes down. You can see kind of the plastic still out there. All you got to do is press on either side of it, and that eye hole will pop right through. Comes right through. So this one is a 1.5 inch, 1.5. It also comes in a 2 inch, which is basically the same body profile, about the same size of the body, just the skirt's a little bit longer on this one. And then a 2 1/4. And with this one, you could put 1/8 of an ounce, a 1/4 ounce jig head. You can get these ones down. So if you're just wanting to catch bass outside of this, next month, where, like I said, you can pretty much throw the kitchen sink at them. They're in spawning mode. They're just going to be focused on gorging, probably not going to be super particular. But once we get outside of that window, they go into the post-spawn, summer pattern, fall pattern, winter pattern. These types of small finesse presentations will catch very big bass out of your ponds. So always good to have just some small profile green pumpkin with some red in them anywhere you go. But these are your sunfish assassins. So in about a month, when sunfish start spawning, getting up on the beds, you can use let's see, in this other box. That was pretty much the only sunfish or crappie deal I have in that box. This is more of my all-around panfish box. So lots of baby shad, some little swim baits, things like that. But you can use just a very small hook in a weight. So a piece of split shot, little tiny hook. Now, I like the ones with the shorter shanks. You can elect for Aberdeen hooks that have the longer shanks. It's just a matter of how comfortable are you of getting the fish, getting that hook out of the fish's mouth. I typically try to set the hook pretty quick. I don't let them get it back in them where I'm trying to plier it out. But basically, this is my setup. This backpack right here, it's got, the bottom, I can fit 4 tackle boxes here. I can fit 4 tackle boxes up top. Got all of my, clippers, nippers, and then pockets for extra line, stuff like that. this is it. I can carry this around anywhere I go and put it in my kayak. I can walk it around. I recommend getting a good fishing backpack if you're serious about pond fishing, you know, where you want to go fish for a few hours, move around. If you're just wanting to go with the family, put some lawn chairs up, set up for the day in one spot, then you're going to be more for the little hook, the weight, and then, you know, something to carry your bobbers in. That's going to be effective, you know, most of the year, 9 months out of the year. Hook, piece of worm. Now, your worm's always going to be your best option. A night crawler, go buy a couple worms. I don't typically mess with worms because they require refrigerated storage. And you by yourself typically will not go through, especially when you're fishing with a hook that size. You're only pulling off a little tiny chunk of the worm. So you're going to go home with a dozen worms in a box. They don't last in the fridge for that long. You know, they will get stinky, and especially don't ever leave one in the back of your truck when it's 90 degrees outside. So I elect for crappie nibbles. They're great. No refrigeration required. Safe container. Can fit these in my pocket, my backpack. So I just put a crappie nibble on my hook shank. And this is all it is, pretty basic. You wouldn't think that there's much to it. Like, here's your little hook. Here's your crappie nibble. Put that on. I put my piece of split shot about, you know, fingernail above where I tied on my hook. And then I put the bobber up, depending on what time of year it is. If they're spawning and they're shallow, you know, I might only put that bobber 4 or 5 inches above where my split shot weight is at. Other times of the year, it might be 12 inches to 2.5 feet, just depending on how deep they are. But that's going to work most of the year, especially into the later spring. They'll start going hard after the crappie nibbles. Now you get into the dog days of summer, you get into the winter, you're probably not going to be as effective. You're probably going to want to utilize some type of natural bait like a night crawler. They just seem to favor that more when we get into those winter months, hot summer months. But April, May, June, September, October, November, crappie nibble is going to work just as well as anything else. And the great thing about them is that you don't have to refrigerate them and they don't make a mess. You know, if anybody's ever played with worms before, you just can't help but keep what they're stored in off your hands, and you're rubbing it on your pants. It's just a mess. So I elect for crappie nibbles, but crickets, worms, leeches, anything with just a little tiny, again, go with as small of a hook as you can use so you open up the amount of fish that you can catch. We're coming up on that great time of year where you can get into a 12, 11, 10-inch sunfish, you know, real big trophy sunfish that will come up into that pre-spawn period and then eventually make their beds. And they typically tend to hang around those bedding areas a lot longer than your crappie and your bass will. Crappie and bass they get in, they get out. Sunfish kind of take their time building those nests, hanging around them. So typically you get like 4 to 6 weeks of really good sun fishing starting about the middle of May, maybe even a little bit earlier, just depending on where the water temperatures are at. But so, you know, baby shad, there's lots of different brands. I favor Bobby Garland's, but Bass Pro makes a brand, Cabela's makes a brand, Mr. Crappie makes a brand. Everybody has, you know, here's 2 of the same color. This one is Bass Pro. This one is Bobby Garland. Only difference is this one, I can feel the difference, you know, in the texture of the bait. This one takes less effort to move that tail. As you can see, it like I'm barely moving either one of my hands, and this tail over here on the Bobby Garland's just more active. So I typically go with these when your crappie are spawning, which should be right now, and they've pushed up shallow. It doesn't really matter. If anything, I use some of the more generic brands at this time of year just because they're $2, $3 less a bag, and I go through 50, 60 of these in a weekend. But, you know, keeping a box, you know, this one's pretty big, but you could use a smaller size. This one just has a bunch of colors, but keeping your jig heads, your split shot, you know, you got everything you need right here to catch every sunfish and every crappie that's in your pond. You know, when it comes to coloration, stick with natural colors, you know, more often than not. When crappie are coming up right now to spawn, they're looking to gorge. So they're looking at things like, you know, shiners that are in the pond, mosquito fish, baby bluegill, anything that they can get a hold of. So I typically favor a color like this. Obviously a lime green chartreuse. Crappie can't resist that anywhere in the country. So these are kind of my standard go-to colors. Occasionally you'll get a decent bite with something like this. But again, it's that yellow through it really gets their attention. And then the whole smattering of, different types of flakes in them. Like this does a good job. I have golden shiners in most of the ponds that I fish. So, this golden coloration typically does pretty well. Obviously, you can't go wrong with just a basic white, whether it's a pearl white or whether it's more of like a ghost white, a little bit more translucent through it. But doesn't take much. I typically use a 32nd ounce jig head. I like the really slow fall rate and then just barely turning the reel and just, very subtly just kind of popping that rod tip as I'm reeling it in. Now, you can throw this under a float. And if it's a windy day, especially if it's a windy day and you're not casting either directly into the wind or the wind's at your back, you have more of a crosswind, because crappie are notorious for upbiting, where they come up and they grab it, but they don't turn to go. So you actually don't get that tension. What you feel is a little nick in the line. It's like it's a pause. You'll feel something and then you'll continue to pick up your slack. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, I got tension. And then you set the hook. So putting either a fixed bobber or a slip float, again, getting just a little bag that you can fit bobbers in. You can put your bobber stops and everything else. Convenient, easy to put in your pocket if that's the only thing you're taking to a pond. That's another big thing with pond fishing is try to stay organized. Figure out the best way that you like to fish, how you like to fish, when you like to fish, and get it organized in a way to where it fits in your pocket or it fits in a backpack. Because the last thing you want to do is just be carrying around a bunch of rods and reels, a bunch of different things. Figure out what works on your pond that you fish and replicate it, because 99% of the time, outside of these brief spawning periods where the whole playbook is open, these are going to work year round. These are going to work year round. This is going to work year round. But we get into that spawning window and all of a sudden you start bringing out some bright colors or some hot pink, something like this. And what happens is when your crappie come into spawn, those 3 to 4 weeks prior to the spawn, they're just gorging. They're going to push up out of those wintering grounds. They're going to come up into those transition areas up to where their bedding is. Now, crappie are looking for hard bottom to spawn. So if you know that there's crappie in a pond, you've picked up one before, but you don't really get into them that often, this is the time of year. Walk around your pond, survey it. What's in here? What's up against the bank? Where you have rocks, pebbles, hard debris right near the bank, that's where you need to be fishing, because that's what crappie need to spawn. They're not going to spawn in that mud, in that grass. It's going to suffocate the eggs. And they'll typically do it on wind-driven sides. So in ponds, that's almost always going to be the north side of a pond in Oklahoma. For small ponds, typically April, May, the majority outside of this week, the majority of the wind is typically coming out of the south. And that's bringing in the warmer air, warmer water displacement. It hits up against the bank. You get rebound current. It oxygenates those eggs. It aerates them. So that's where you're looking for spawning fish. Both, bass, catfish, they're all going to do the same type of nesting in the same type of areas. Now, that's not a universal truth. There will be fish that will spawn on the south side. There will be fish that will spawn kind of in, uncharacteristic places, like, crappie will lay eggs on top of a log. A big hardwood that's fallen in, a big oak tree fell in the water, they'll spawn right on the top of that. They just need that hard structure to keep the eggs from getting suffocated. So look for areas around those types of structure where they're going to spawn. And right now they should be attempting to start spawning. But they're going to be in those areas and they're going to be actively engaged in gorging on whatever available forage there is for them. So it's very important to know what your prey species are in a pond, which is why if you're going to a place you've never fished before, throw on a crappie nibble or a piece of worm. Start small. Catch as many small fish as you can to get a good base. What do the sunfish look like in this pond? Because sunfish don't look the same everywhere you go, depending on water clarity, depending on how many different hybrid crosses are naturally occurring between more than likely your green sunfish, your blue gill, and your red ear sunfish. Those are going to be probably your 3 primary species. You move over into the eastern part of the state, you probably are going to have some long ears or maybe some pumpkin seeds mixed in, but they're going to naturally cross over time. So pulling them out, looking at what's my coloration pattern through those, then you can kind of dictate, especially for bass fishing, what colors do I need stick to mimic. But you're going to be safe anywhere you go with greens, yellows, light blues, and whites. Something like this. These are going to consistently catch fish. Now, what happens is after those crappies spawn, the females are out. The females move right up, drop eggs, go right back. They're going to take a couple of days to rest, feed, but they're going to move right back out to those transition areas. Those males are now going to guard the fry. They're going to care for the eggs. They're going to stay for about 2 weeks and provide some parental care. They're not actively feeding. What they are doing is actively defending anything that comes near. So what tends to happen is you get really good crappie fish and you're filling up bucket after bucket after bucket for a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Then all of a sudden you're getting bit like crazy, just ding, 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 ding. No hook set, no hook set, no hook set, no hook set. It's because those male crappie are not trying to eat the bait. You may even be thinking to yourself, oh, it must just be a bunch of small fish that are in there. Nope, it's all the same fish. So what you can do to kind of offset that is you want that hook point as close to the back of that bait as possible. So if you continue to use soft plastics, I recommend cutting, anywhere from 1/4 to 1/2 inch off with scissors and then sliding it right back up. So that hook point is, right here at the base of the tail. But what you ought to look to do if you want to continue to catch and clean crappie or just, fill up the bucket is crappie nibble on a hook, because it'll swing in front of them and they'll think it's a threat. They'll bite it. They're obviously right on the hook. Nothing they can do about it. Or go to like a rooster tail, something where you have the treble hook off the back of the bait. But you want to get that hook point as close to the back of the bait once spawning has begun. And that's pretty much going to cover your crappie in a pond. Now, obviously, using live minnows, things like that, but it's just not really necessary in a pond unless you just fish something that's just so heavily pressured. Crappie typically kind of throw the inhibitions to the wind for about a month a year, and it just doesn't really matter what's being thrown at them. But in the lead up to that, stick to your more natural colors, maybe even like a black and blue. This is going to do a good job of mimicking. If you have any red ear bluegill crosses, they'll get this type of coloration through their body, kind of that teal on the bottom, dark back. But that kind of covers it for crappie. If you want to go run over to the bait shop, get a bucket of minnows and throw them out there, that's going to catch fish too. But it's just really not necessary in ponds, just because it's easy. It should be like shooting fish in a barrel. If the body of water is under 2 acres, you should be able to make a cast to every single point on that pond from any part of the bank. And then again, if you can put a float of some kind out there to be on the water, then you can dead drift. And that's actually a great way to get to know, your pond, where a lot of times if I take a kayak out, I'll take a weight with no hook. I'll just tie a weight onto the end of my line and I'll drop it below the kayak and I'll row around to get my depths. Where's my channel break of, wherever it was dammed, where are my ledges at? How steep are these shelves that come up? Are they kind of the common depth, or am I getting slack because I'm coming uphill really quick? You can do that from the bank as well. It's just a little bit harder to determine exactly where your weight is in relation to where you're at, but always a good thing especially if you're fishing a pond you're not familiar with, give it a once over. Just walk around it. If the water is a little bit clear, you might be able to get to see some of those contour lines. If it's a really good established creek channel that was dammed that comes through, you should be able to see kind of the offshoot sets of maybe there's some riparian zone trees that weren't cut all the way down or they were stumped. And you can kind of see where those boundaries are at. Because essentially when you flood outside of a creek bed to make a pond, everything on the sides should be relatively the same depth as they come back to the bank. There's going to be a little bit of a slope to it, but if you ever just walked a creek bank, you're pretty much on flat ground when you're up on the top. Well, that's all you're damming over. There might be some, depressions in the ground, and those will create additional types of structure in your pond. But it's just always good to just go learn your pond. How is it set up? And then you're going to be able to find fish quicker because you're going to know what they're relating to at different times of the year. So again, same thing works for sunfish. It usually is just a month behind the crappie. So in your ponds, everything we just talked about for crappie, do the same exact thing for sunfish. I like to run little tubes. It's fun to catch them on artificials, especially those big, you can barely palm them because they're humped over so big, especially when you get into like the 12, maybe even the 13-inch fish. You're looking at 1.5 pounds, 1.75 pounds fish, where it's basically just a dinner plate. They're fun. You know, they fight hard when you get them on these hooks. But if you get them on these little guys like this, typically I'm using a really, really light action rod. A 1.5 pound sunfish on a 4-foot micro light rod with 4-pound test will break you off. It will turn you. It will throw the hook. They're a whole bunch of fun. Every May I remind myself how much fun I have catching sunfish. And then I kind of get addicted to it for a month, and that's all. I won't even bass fish or do anything else. I just want to go catch 10-inch sunfish. But all those tactics, they're going to be the same. You might even use, you know, some little type of, you know, a stick worm like this. You can either, you know, rig it in with an offset worm hook through the top and fish it weightless this way, or you can throw, you know, some type of little like drop shot hook, wacky rigged hook. Let's see, I've got one sitting right here. Something like this. You know, just a little hook like that, and you can just wacky rig it right through the middle of the body, so it'll pulsate down. You can catch some pretty big sunfish doing that. You're going to eliminate the rest of, you know, your 6, 7, 8-inch fish. They don't, you know, unless it's a green sunfish, or if it's a blue-green hybrid that just happens to have taken on more of the green sunfish's mouth properties, you know, you're looking at something that's about that big. So they got to be able to inhale that through. It typically takes a 12, 13-inch fish, you know, to get this in it. So keeping it small hooks with natural bait or crappie nibbles, or using small naturally colored tubes, small naturally colored rooster tails, small naturally colored, or, you know, maybe a little brightly colored baby shad. And then where did the third box go? So the other one that I've had success with crappie in particular, but you will pick up the occasional sunfish, is little pre-molded swim baits. So something that's in a bluegill pattern, or, you know, like a shiner color. Little. This at one time was kind of gold clear. It's been in the water a bunch, so it's kind of off stain now. But these two, they're a little big. You know, you're going to eliminate a lot of catch with these, but you can get into some lunker panfish with these. They swim pretty good. The only knock I have on these pre-molded is that, you know, you got that internally weighted hook that's in there. And what happens is, you know, they grab it enough times, and when you're setting the hook, they just have a bad tendency at the eyelid to pull up through the top of the bait. Sometimes it happens after 2 fish. Sometimes it happens after 20 fish. It's kind of a, you know, a gamble every time. And these are kind of expensive. I mean, like a 3-pack of these are Storm brand shad. You can buy the Bass Pro brand. They're a little bit cheaper, but you get what you pay for. I have noticed that ones like these that are a Bass Pro brand, that internally weighted hook typically comes out of the plastic a lot sooner than the Storm ones do. That's why the previous box I had with the jig heads and just baby shad do that, because a bag of plastics costs, you know, not even as much as a 3-pack of these do. But if you have these will work, and they will catch some lunker panfish. I've had a lot of success with crappie on these, especially bigger crappie, 12 to 14-inch crappie. They really like those. And all it is just a real slow retrieve. I mean, you can't reel slow enough. Just keep it turning and just barely popping that rod tip. You can't really feel your bait because it's, you know, such a 1/32 ounce jig head is really hard to feel that contact. But every time that you pop that thing in the water is just doing this. Just that little subtle twitch makes this thing dart. And it's going to do that with your tubes, and it's going to do it with your little swim baits. And those are going to be your best bet anytime that you're out pan fishing a pond. If you're not just using hook, worm, bobber. That's obviously go-to number one. That's going to catch the most fish. But these are going to equal them pretty closely. So that goes through that. We'll do catfish really quick. You know, like I said, unless you just have a pond that is just chock full of 1 and 2 pound channel cats, and that's the majority of the species that's in there, your typical farm pond is probably going to hold, you know, a couple dozen decent sized catfish, you know, 3 pounds and over, all the way up to You know, I've fished the same neighborhood ponds for a decade. I pulled the 18-pounder out one time. I thought I finally had a 10-pound bass on, and I beached an 18-pound channel cat that I had to walk out into the water to get, because it was too big to get up into the shallow water to get it out. So you'll get some bigger ones. So typically how I fish for them, and you can employ a lot of tactics. If you're a microwaved hot dog person, you know, to fish for them, if you're just on night crawlers, if you're using punch bait, stink bait, any of the Berkeley Gulp brands that are, you know, pseudo natural, pseudo artificial, all of those probably work. I always elect for natural colors, natural bait from the source. You know, what's the prey source in the body of water? So typically what I'll do if I'm going to catfish, or if I'm going to live bluegill fish for bass, which we'll get into that in a little bit, you know, hook, split shot, crappie nibble, catch a, you know, whatever size sunfish that's under 6 inches, cut it in half. I'll take the tail. Now you can elect to use 1/0, 2/0, 3/0, 4/0, 5/0, 6/0 circle catfish hooks. I just use little tiny octopus hooks. This one is a size 1. I can get the hook set. It typically doesn't get all the way into the back. They get a real good pull on the front, and I don't want a lot of that line in there. Especially a lot of my bass rods that I use in ponds they're strung up with braid, but I have a 2-3 foot fluorocarbon leader tied on. You get a catfish on, they roll up that line when you reel them in. It slimes the line. They put nicks in the line. They, you know, do all that. And I found that the bigger the hook, where it can kind of get in there, they just seem to do more damage to the line with those bigger hooks. So I started using real small octopus hooks. Gets the job done. Don't have any problem setting the hook. And then they're just easy to pop out. You get those big circle hooks. Anybody who's messed around with channel cats, they have all that film on either side. Those things just get wound down in there. And the bigger the hook, the bigger the barb, just the longer it takes to knock those things out of the mouth. So something like this, I'll catch a bluegill. I always keep, you know, pair of pliers with me, cut the bluegill in half, chunk the head back into the water, take the tail, you know, just right up on that ridge in between where the dorsal's at. So I'll cut it right behind the gill plate. I'll save that dorsal, but I'll cut, you know, the head's gone. So I'll run this right along the ridge of the back, you know, just right behind most bluegill. If they have any type of green cross in them, they'll have that little identifier dot on their dorsal. I'll tuck it in right underneath that on the ridge of the back. That way, when the fish comes up, grabs it, turns and runs, typically you're setting the hook through the ridge of the back, pulling it clean free. They end up losing, you know, their meal, you know, floats down to the bottom and turtle or another catfish gets it. But you don't have to mess with that bait when you're getting the hook out, which I found just to be more convenient with catfish, because the more time that you have to handle a catfish, the more likely it is you're going to get barbed, bit, something's going to happen. You always find a way to get hurt by a catfish. So if I can take the bait out of its mouth by ripping the hook through the ridge of the back and getting it, you know, a good hook set, typically in the top of the mouth, I can typically just pop them out with my finger, but if I need the pliers, pops right out. So that's going to be your standard setup for catfish. You know, you can obviously do it year round. Typically pond fishing for catfish really gets good in the summer, you know, like anywhere else, but you can get those fish to come up into really shallow water right around dusk. So a lot of times, you know, if me and the family are out fishing, I'll just run glow bobbers, or the little glow sticks that you can attach to the top of a stick bobber. I don't have any with me, but they, if you've seen them like at Walmart, they just sold like a little black pack with neon. And they come with these little rings where you slide one ring over the top of the bobber, and then you put the glow stick in the other little ring. And then I'll just drop, you know, a weightless hook with the half of a bluegill on, maybe a foot or two below the bobber, and we'll just let those sit out after dark. And then it's just a really easy way to, oh, there goes the bobber swimming off. Because I typically don't wait when I throw out a bluegill. Like even if I'm on the bottom, I'll just throw it out and let that fish slowly sink. That way, anything that picks it up, I'm just waiting for that line to get tight, because obviously when fish eat other fish, especially bluegill, they have spines all over them. So your hook really doesn't bother any fish. They don't really know that they've been hooked. It's not until you start to play them and turn them that they feel that they're attached to something. And that's typically when they start their first run. So I like them to have it weightless so they don't feel it just feels like they're picking up a fish. And then I'll just watch my line get tight and I'll reel up right to the point where I feel that tension and then I hammer the hook home. And that's if I'm going to do it off the bottom if I'm not using a bobber. But like I said, any type of bait that you want to use, homemade bait, any of the dough baits you can buy at any sporting goods store, they're all going to be effective. I'm just a big advocate of using prey sources that exist in that body of water. I feel like when the fishing isn't as, lights out where you can just throw the kitchen sink at them, that's going to catch you more fish during those periods of time when those fish get a little bit more gun shy. They get more finicky. They're a little bit more exploratory than just a reactionary, I'm going to go eat. So that kind of takes us through, our crappie, any type of panfish, any sunfish that's going to be in there. Your green sunfish, I didn't really touch on this. When we're just talking relationship to the bank, your green sunfish are going to be the closest, tightest to the bank. They're going to inhabit the shallowest of water. Then your bluegills and then your red ear are going to be out a little bit farther. So if you have some big red ear, maybe you caught one during the spawn and it's July or it's February and you're going to try to go target big sunfish at that time of year, your red ear are going to typically inhabit the deeper parts. They're going to be out in that creek channel, hovering around root wads, grass mats, anything like that. Your bluegill will typically hang out more in those transition zones. A bluegill in a pond is the largemouth basses. That's his Burger King for the day. So those fish typically won't go too far out to hang out around those root wads and balls with where those bass are going to winter. Or where they're going to go out during the summer. So they'll typically just move back into those transition areas near their spawning bed and kind of hug those shelf channels for the most part of the year, except for, moving into this window, coming into May and June, all of those fish are going to push up into water that's probably less than 2 feet deep. You're probably going to be able to see them. If you have clear water, you're going to be able to see those beds. And that's the other thing. When you hit April, May, walk around a pond. If it's clear enough, you will see those bedding areas. So that's obviously where you want to target. And if you want to catch some of the bigger fish, especially leading up into the spawn, you'll see a bunch of little males down there working, picking up pebbles, building their little bed, and then putting the pebbles in the middle and rearranging them. And you'll watch them do their little song and dance, stealing from each other. And those bigger females will just be kind of hovered out. So if you, go with the hook and bobber approach, cast that bobber out about 10 feet beyond the last bed that you can see. If you can see that there's a clear distinguishable end to the cluster of bedding areas, go about 10, 15 feet past that in like 4 feet of water. So if you can use a slip cork, try to get it as close to the bottom as you can, because those bigger fish are just kind of be tucked in on those transition areas down in the grass, especially if you have a grass line. But if there's like a root wad of stump, they're going to be tucked on it, probably low in the water column. So you don't want to get up too high, because again, those fish know, even if you're a big sunfish, you might not know that. Your DNA says, if I leave this root wad, a bass is going to eat me. So typically to catch those bigger fish, you got to get closer to the bottom around those types of cover. And again, there's no right way to do it. I'm just showing you guys what I know is tried and true. I know that if you take those green pumpkin squirm and squirt tubes to any pond in the state, you're going to have success at any day of the year. And then I'll kind of show you what the go-tos are for bass, because bass are going to be the one fish that might not be as consistent from body of water to body of water to body of water. They might favor a different presentation. They might favor a slightly different color. They're going to be a little bit more picky than your sunfish, crappie, and catfish are going to be. So things like this they're going to work year round anywhere you go. And that's kind of the point of these Ask an Angler series, is there's a million different ways to fish. We want you to find what you're most comfortable with, what you enjoy fishing for the most, and how you like doing it the most. And that starts with catching fish. So if this is just the basis for you, this is a great foundational building block to start with, is just a little cheap $2.99 15 pack of squirm and squirts. And you can take those to the river, take them to the creek, take them to the pond. Going to be lights out. Little hard to fish in big water because it's obviously a 1/32. You got waves and current and everything else. They're a little bit more difficult to fish in the bigger water, but they're great for ponds. And again, nobody's really chimed in yet, but if you have questions at any point, if I move past something, too quickly, I didn't address something within the subject matter that you want to talk about, feel free to use the chat bar at any time. This is meant to be conversational, open-ended. This is for you. So if you have a question, plug it in there and I'll address it as we go. All right, so I'm going to start going through the bass boxes. And so I showed some of those little swim baits, but, you know, a box of pre-molded swim baits, or, you know, some with some jig heads, something like that. These I've found a lot of success with for some bigger fish. Typically that couple of weeks before the spawn, I'll throw some pre-molded swim baits around. You know, I typically try to keep it in a bluegill coloration, but I've also found success with more kind of generic shad coloration, something like this. These are just, there's nothing fancy about these. Cast them straight out, keep them off the bottom. So however you can reel as slow as possible without getting either hung up on your bottom cover. So if you have grass mats, weed line, if there's a lot of hardwood debris, litter, brush piles that are in there, whatever it takes to reel as slowly as possible without getting hung up in those. You want to be just above them, because bass just have something in them that when something swims over their head, it's just they're just ingrained to have that reactionary strike. And because swim baits are so subtle in the water, they're not banging around, they're not flashing. They go through just like an unsuspecting bait fish. That's going to trigger more strikes than anything else. Can you catch fish with your lipless crankbaits, your lip crankbaits, your offset spinners? Absolutely. You're just going to have more overall success using more natural, more subtle approaches in smaller water. Those fish can just get shell shocked. When you're out on a lake, they hear boat motors, they hear music. There's constant calamity on big reservoirs. Those fish kind of get used to that. So your bigger profile baits typically have some success, because not only are they're competing against other fish, your lure is competing against all the other noises that are going on in the water. So when you're looking for those prototypical largemouth reactionary bass strikes in a big lake, that's what you're getting it from. You're banging a crankbait off of a log. You're shooting a spinner bait through. You're running a buzz bait on the top. You're trying to create as much disruption and distraction to get a fish to reactionary strike. In a pond, you don't get that luxury. Typically quiet, typically calm, not a lot of sounds. Even if you're in a neighborhood pond, you usually can't hear a lot of loud music thumping, creating vibrations, people in the parking lot in their vehicles. It's not causing that same type of, competition for sound that you're going to get on a big reservoir. So always try to downsize your rigs, keep them subtle, small natural profiles. So that's where a good pre-molded swim bait comes in real handy in March and April in your farm ponds. You're going to have some success with it throughout the course of the summer, but typically once those fish have kind of got out of that spawn mode, now you're looking for even more of a subtle fall presentation. And we'll get into that right now. So probably not the most traditional way to fish a pond, but effective, especially if you're in a neighborhood pond that might get a lot of heavy pressure, and things like a stickworm, which again, if you hook it with a either an offset hook. So two different ways to do this. I always fish them weightless. If I'm in a pond, I very rarely ever add additional weight to my line, whether that be a bullet weight, so a Texas rig, a piece of split shot, unless it's for my little, tiny hook to catch sunfish, where I just need something because the power bait will float and this hook isn't heavy enough to pull the crappie nibble down. Outside of that, I very rarely use anything weighted in a pond. I want soft, slow, subtle vibrations that go through the water. So there's two ways you can do this. You can do it with the offset hook and fish it weightless and weedless. So what you're going to do is on the underbelly of your bait. So this happens to be a two-tone stickworm. So our underside is kind of this lighter color and the top side is this black color. You'll notice this on fish if you have handled enough of them. All fish, for their defense mechanism, darker shades on the back, lighter shades on the bottom. Why? Because when they get up near the surface and it's a dark back, that keeps them safe from avian predators. And when they're up above predator fish, they match in the light, the sky. So that's why your underbellies are always going to be lighter tones. Your top So if you ever find, a bait like this that's two-toned, the lighter side should be the side that's facing the bottom when you're retrieving that. So, not a whole lot to it, but those little subtle things on pressured water might come in handy. So going to take it, we're going to go right through the nose. And basically a good rule of thumb is just push it down to where the hook turns. And so bring it out through that belly, bring it out through the underside, and then slide it up your hook point, and it'll turn on there, and it'll be like this. And then you're just going to run that hook point back through the belly, up the top, and then all you have to do is just pull it forward in front of the hook point and then let go. That embeds it. So now when a fish comes and grabs it, it knocks this down, hook point exposed, set the hook. What I'm looking for when I'm fishing like this, if I'm going to use an offset hook, so it's straightforward. So I'm not going to get that pulsating action of it moving like this through the water column. It's going to be more of a quick dart, fall, dart, fall. I won't work them too often. I will pitch this around heavy cover and I'll let it fall. And you're not going to get a bite. You're not going to get a big double over. The best case scenario is that they grabbed it and they're moving so quickly that your line actually just starts to go. I mean, there's nothing to it. But sometimes it's just you're watching your line, you're watching your line, you're watching. All of a sudden, there's just a pause. No movement. And all of a sudden, you're starting to get slack on your line. That bass just grabbed it and sat right there. So if you ever, this is more of a line watching technique when you're using weightless presentations, because you want slack in your line. You want there to be enough line for this to be able to just freely drop through the water. I won't work it too much because it's weightless. So it would take me forever to get it in, fishing it the way I want to, because one pop of the rod tip, this sucker's coming right back up to the surface. It's got no weight to hold it down. And then it takes 5 or 6 seconds to flutter back down. We'll add that up, doing that 30 times. It takes you 5 minutes to get it in. So typically I'll maybe give it 1 or 2 pops around cover, reel it up, pitch it right back. So that's one approach to doing this. The other one that, is probably easier because you get a better feel of it is going with some type of either drop shot hook. Some hooks are labeled wacky worm or wacky rig hooks. Basically all it is it's just, kind of a double wide octopus hook where you have a pretty wide gap between where your eye hole's at and where your hook point's at. So all you're going to do with that is you're just going to run it right through the center of the bait, again, through the bottom side so that the darker shade is up top. Set that in there, pull it all the way to where the hook point is exposed. And again, pitch it out there. It'll just do this in the water. And typically you're going to get hit on the fall. Very rarely will you work it 5 or 6 times and then have a fish come and get it, because it's already seen it. It's already watched it come down. You didn't move it 10 feet and that fish was just following behind it. It's made up its mind at that point that it wants it or it doesn't want it. But again, if you want to run a Texas rig, if you want to throw a bullet weight on there, especially with your offset hook, you can run that just like that and just drag it along the bottom, especially some of these. So this is a Z-Man. They call these the TRD. So there's the big TRD, and then there's the finesse TRD, which is the little smaller version. But every brand makes these. Yamamoto, they're called Senkos. Zoom, they're called, forget what they're called for Zoom. Yum, they're dingers. So they all have a different brand name. They're stick worms. So anything that looks like this, you got a couple of different ways to fish them. You can also throw them on, this is becoming more popular now with the exposure of YouTube and professional bass fishing kind of gaining some traction amongst more mainstream culture. You may have heard what's called a Ned rig. So Z-Man patented the Ned rig, which is a Midwest finesse style. And what it is it's a jig head that's shaped like this. So the weight's on the bottom where this actually stands up. Probably won't do it in my palm, but on a flat surface, it stands up. So, your normal jig head, like this, your little round jig head, falls over. So what you can do if you're going to throw weight is now, Z-Man's not the only one who makes Ned rigs anymore. I think I've seen them for Yum makes their Ned rig. They're becoming increasingly popular. But if you take one of the smaller ones, like a 3-inch stick worm, and then you run it up again, keep it on that Keep it on the side that you want it to pop through. So it's not going to make much of a difference because it's going to be more of a vertical presentation than, horizontal through the water column. So you just work that on like you would anything else. It's probably a little bit too much. The only problem with these Z-Man is the proprietary blend that makes them awesome for their floating action and that. Once you pull them over the hook point or the barb, it's pretty impossible to try to get them back off without ruining the inside of them. But anyways, you cast this out, you let it fall to the bottom. Now you can fish this a bunch of different ways. You can straight retrieve it in and it's going to kind of be down like this and this tail is going to be doing that. Or you can hop it, let it hit the bottom, slowly pick your rod tip up. It'll, jump from here, pop up, land. Then slowly reel up your slack until you can feel contact with the bait again. Then slowly raise it up again and just hop it along the bottom. And same thing, bass is going to come down to the bottom. It's going to scoop it up and grab it. But you're not going to get that power fishing action. All your power baits, your crank baits, your spinner baits, your buzz baits, things that you have constant contact with while you're retrieving, those are the big bang, double over bites. Like no mistake about it. I ran into something. All of these finesse techniques, it's watching your line, watch your line, watch your line. Some people, like on open face spinning reels, they might hold the line like a gun trigger, just holding it right off of the bail so they can feel it. I just watch it. I'm constantly just, polarized sunglasses, take the shine off the water, watch where your line goes into the water and just watch that. If it shoots forward, if it does something weird, if it pauses, that's kind of indicating that you're onto your bite. But this is, kind of a third style. If you're not going to run again, you could hook it up on this and drag this along the bottom. It's going to have similar action because your hook's kind of free. So again, these kind of float a little bit. So it's not really going to be dragging on the bottom like this. It's going to be more of like a 45-degree angle upward. The fish will see the vibration and it might stimulate their lateral line system, cause reactionary bite, might be a search bite. They might be cruising a shoreline looking for crawdads or something else, looking for that bottom feed. So that's another way to get after them. Let me look at the questions real quick before I move on to the next thing. Is weightless heavy enough to fish on my bait caster or stick to spinning gear? It really just depends on the rod. A heavy action rod for a bait caster is probably not going to be very effective with weightless techniques. Even on a hook, this alone weighs enough that you're not going to have trouble casting it with the bait caster. But if you have maybe like a crappie bait caster set up where, a little bit less of a backbone, a little bit more action at the rod tip where you can zing it out there with 6-8 pound test, you're going to be all right. But it's just typically, I watched a video from somebody and they spelled it out perfectly. Spinning, S is spinning, right? So S is slack, casting's contact. So you use a bait caster to always not finesse. You power fish with the bait caster. Constant contact with the casting rod. Spinning rod, constant slack. Everything is slack fishing. That's why the presentation. So can you do it with a bait caster? Yes. Are you going to be as effective as you are with the spinning reel? Probably not. Fly fishing ponds for bass. Okay, so I didn't bring any fly fishing gear with me today like I have for some of these other ones. One of our other videos on the link that I sent the email to our archive, I think it was the close to home pond one. I think I had a fly fishing segment on that. But if you're fly fishing for bass in a pond, you're going to want to stick to your jig head fly. So that might be a Clouser minnow. It might be, there's lots of, private brand, maybe not big generic box store fly where they have jig heads on them. It's more like a bass hook, and it's some type of streamer that they've tied on. Some of them have double joints on them. That would be my first go-to. That or a Clouser minnow. And stick to, your white with olives through it, black, shiners, sculpin patterns, things like that. Again, try to keep it as natural presentation as possible. Beadhead woolly bugger, you're probably not going to get a great fall rate on it. So you might have to slap on some split shot, which again, the problem with fly fishing for bass with those heavier deals, you can't make those pretty casts and you're trying to strip. And if you're not out on the water, you're fishing uphill. So you're stripping that, and you're about to go pick up the cast again. Oh, found the weed line. And, maybe a dry fly, the the box store Bet. I think the brand's Bet's bass poppers. Those are sold at Bass Pro and Cabela's and any fly shop in North America. So maybe, try popping action here in maybe a month, low light hours starting, morning after late afternoon. And then as we get into June, you probably top water fish all day. Depending on where fish are sitting, if you have a lot of overhead cover with shade, you probably throw a stimulator out there, like little size, 8 stimulator with rubber legs, a hopper, an ant pattern. You're going to get a lot of bluegill. It's really fun to fly fish ponds for sunfish. I'll throw like a size 18, either like a pheasant tail, rubber leg yellow Sally, even a lightning bug, and I'll throw it out there. And you could throw a float, you could put a strike indicator on and just let it there, and it's probably going to go under and start bouncing around. I like to, strip it and just very quick strips. And then I'm watching the end of that fly line where it's connected to the leader. Did it dart? Did it do anything when I'm in between the strip where it's, same kind of principle, kind of like finesse fishing with a nymph. But streamers and woolly buggers, probably your best bet. Can you pick them up maybe on like a big stone fly that stripped through the water? Maybe. It's just cumbersome. And depending on what pond it is, back casting can be an issue. So you got to get creative with roll casting. And again, you're probably using something that's weighted, that's falling pretty quickly. So you're going to end up running it uphill into weed lines. Top water would be my recommendation for ponds, especially if you're fishing for bass. Wait here about another month and start hitting it first light, last light with some poppers around the shorelines, and you probably pick up some pretty good fish. Fly version of flukes and poppers. Exactly. Nailed it. All right, so let's move into the next topic. So let's talk about drop shot. So drop shot, again, like the Ned rig, is becoming increasingly popular as, fishing has become, especially during the pandemic. There weren't live sports. They were fishing in June and July of last year when there was no other sports being played. So you might have noticed turning on ESPN on a Saturday afternoon and there was live bass fishing on television. You probably saw every channel you were on. You probably saw 3 commercials every break from Cabela's, Bass Pro, Abu Garcia, Academy. The outdoors are open. The outdoors are open. So with that, there came a lot of great online content. People have been learning terminology a lot more. But typically drop shotting started off as a way for professional bass anglers up north to catch smallmouth bass. They tend to hang out in that deeper water. The way that they react to things, a drop shot was just so effective because you can determine where you're at in the water column at all times when you're fishing from a vertical presentation. So, I can see on my depth finder fish are holding 2 feet off the bottom. Perfect. I'm going to put my hook 18 inches above my weight. I'm going to cast it out there, and using very, these subtle drop shot type deals or, dingers. This one's too big. That one's going to flop the hook too much. I put it on this. A little 3-inch one though. Perfect. And all you're doing is, you can dead stick it. These things will float. This thing will sit here in the water. You could just leave it alone. And the little bit of current that's in the water, this thing is going to stay perfectly horizontal, and it's just barely going to do this. So you could literally cast this thing out into a pond and just tight line it. Just reel up to where the slack's gone, hold your rod tip up, and wait for something to come over and slam it. Or when you're doing it, because again, this started as a way to fish off of a boat in Lake Michigan, now, upstate New York, fishing in 60 feet of water. So they're running, half-ounce drop shot weights. You don't need that for your pond. I like to hold tight at like a 3/8. 3/8 seems to be like the perfect weight in a pond. A 1/8 or a 3/16, a little, it just depends. It's whatever you're comfortable with. And again, whatever your rod type is. If you're using a really light action rod, super light, you probably want to run a 1/8 weight. If you have a medium action rod, you're going to be good from, 3/16 through a 3/8. But it's all about that rod tip, because you have to have enough rod tip backbone to be able to effectively move this across the bottom. Now, these are tungsten weights. These are 3 times as expensive for 3 times less what you will get if you just buy a generic lead pack. The only advantage is this tungsten is concentrated weight. So it's a high density in a smaller size. So this right here is going to be, what do we have in there? 1/8. So this is going to be a 1/4 ounce. And a 1/4 ounce of a lead weight is going to be twice as long. It's going to be the same size as this 1/2 ounce. So just less opportunity to find a crack in a rock to get snagged on. So I stick with the tungsten weights, but they're expensive and they come in a 3-pack. So be careful. Again, know your pond when you're casting. Don't throw these around real. If you're going to throw around real heavy cover, just use a piece of split shot. Get like a really, really big piece of split shot and just crimp that to the end of your line. We'll do the quick how-to on how to tie these because that typically ends up being a question at some point in the end. Let's grab some 7-pound test. All right, so doing the drop shot, super simple. The only thing that is important is how you tie that hook on. So like I said, even my spinning outfits, I typically have braid on. So most of my bass rods are going to have most of my spinning gear, unless it's for clear water creeks or maybe super crystal clear water, where I might have a fluorocarbon mainline or mono with the fluoro leader. I'm typically going to be running braid attached to a 2 to 3 foot leader. Now, the only reason I attach a leader in a pond is because if you drill into something with 30-pound braid, 50-pound braid, it's not coming back. So what you end up having to do is you have to cut your line, and then everybody at the pond, you got the line, you're working in a finesse lure and you're like, oh, it's getting tight. And then you go and you set the hook and it's nope, just somebody's braided line that's in the water. So as a courtesy to your pond, to your fish, to your neighbors, to everybody else, if you're going to use braid in a pond, learn how to tie a double uni knot. Super easy. Once you learn how to do it, you're going to be like, I'll never go back to anything again. It's going to save you. The only reason that you see professional bass anglers tying directly onto braid is because their paycheck is betting on not losing that fish. And so by having a double uni knot tied, that's one extra knot on your lines, one more opportunity other than the knot tied to your hook to have a knot pop on something. Braid, if you're not running it through rocks, is pretty resilient. A fluorocarbon leader, you get run into the wrong thing, pop. So I totally get it for tournament anglers. But if you're just fishing your local ponds, do everybody a service, including yourself. Tie on a leader or don't use braid to begin with. So what we're looking for, and I need to get some new hooks. The big thing with the drop shot is there's a lot of hooks that are labeled drop shot. And they are, but they're not. So I'm going to show you an example of a bad hook, or what I would consider to be a bad drop shot hook, even though they're advertised, I think, as Gamakatsu drop shot hook. All right, here's a good example. All right, so this is just an octopus hook. This is labeled and packaged as a double wide octopus hook. Doesn't say drop shot on it. This is labeled as a Gamakatsu drop shot hook. I'm going to show you the difference. Now, is this important to getting bit? No. Is it important to your hookup success? I think so. And what it is you see that eyelid right there? Okay, it's not offset. It's pretty much in line with the hook shank. Look where that hook point is pointed. It's pointed right at the eyelid. So while it may have a big gap down here, that's not a gap. And you're fishing a vertical presentation. What do you want? When that goes into the fish's mouth, you want that thing drilling right into the nose, right up top, roof of the mouth. That's where you have the most control over the fish. You shouldn't have problems landing them when you get them hooked right there. And they feel better when you're fighting them. When you get them in a weird place, and they get sideways, it's hard to turn them. You can lose fish. So what happens with this is you got this big gap. So you have your, let's say you have your, put a non-zman on so I can get it back. We'll just do it with the tube. All right, so let's say you're drop shotting with the tube. So you have this thing on there, comes out right through the nose, sitting back. That fish comes and gets it. Bam. Okay, lined, you got some slack, you kind of feel something, you go to set the hook. What happens? That fish bites down, that's not real, opens its mouth. You go to set the hook. Where's that hook point faced? Right with your line. This hook, offset eyelid. Where's the hook point faced? parallel with the hook shank. What happens when fish goes and grabs this and decides I don't want it and opens its mouth? My line is now not facing straight out of the fish's mouth. It's angled up towards the roof of its mouth. So even though you opened your mouth up, I'm going to catch something when I'm pulling it back out, whether that's the front lip or whether it can still catch up top on the roof. So subtly overlooked, don't always trust the packaging. Just look at the hooks. Go and look at hooks that some of them are labeled as mosquito hooks. All you're looking for is a double wide gap hook where the hook point is parallel with the hook shank, not pointed back at the eyelid. Again, not going to affect you getting bit. What it's going to affect is you getting frustrated that you keep getting bit and you can't set the hook. So we're going to tie this on. So again, if you run a mainline monofilament fluorocarbon leader, this is not important as far as how much line you use to tie it. Like I said, I have a 3-foot leader tied onto braid. I get one chance. If I screw it up, I got to cut my leader off and retie on a leader and redo it. So for me, it's important to where I put the hook. But for, let's say we're going to take about almost 2 feet of line, 20 inches of line. All it is a basic Palomar knot. You can do it one of two ways. These eye holes are big enough that I can double over 7-pound test and get it through. You may be the type of person who wants to run the line through and get your tag end and then turn it over and run it back through to create that loop. This is just saves time. If you can double it over and get it through, it just goes faster, less chance of it popping back out, something happening. So most important part that I said, how you tie the hook. Make sure you go through the hook point side of the eyelid. That is what's going to make it stand up on your line. It's not going to be down, facing the wrong direction. So Palomar knot's just a basic square overhand knot with your little doubled over line. So it makes a nice, perfect circle. And then take that tag end loop and then just run it right over the top of your hook, lure, whatever, when you're tying a knot. That tag end is going to come up above your excess loop. Make sure you wet that line. Sometimes that loop will jump on you. See how it's nice. It's going to cinch up tight now. But every now and then, if it's a windy day, if you didn't wet your line, what will happen is you'll go to cinch it tight and you don't realize that little loop you created goes over the top of the hook and it actually pulls it. I've left hooks like that and haven't had a knot failure. But again, tying a knot the way it's intended to be tied is always best. Okay, so now we take our tag. So most of the time, our excess line, you cut that off, right? No, this is what you're going to attach to your weight. So again, important, make sure that you run your tag end through the hook point side of the eyelid. So we're going to run it right back through the hook eyelid, and then we're going to pull it tight. Preferably not into my finger. And then it stands up on the line, just like that. So these drop shot weights, again, these will be labeled drop shot. They are drop shot weights. And it's an important distinction between like a little dumbbell weight that has a little line holder up there. You'll notice on that line holder, there's a little gap right there, a little eyelid, but up at the top, it's cinched tight. You can't tie a fishing knot onto this. If you try to tie a Palomar, if you try to tie an improved clinch, you will snap your line every time. They're just meant as a cinch. So you just run your line through to your desired depth. So this in a pond, I want to be, because you're going to lose a little bit. You're not fishing directly vertically. You're kind of at a 45-degree angle, bringing it back to the bank. Or if you're on a kayak or a float tube or canoe, again, 45 degrees back out into deeper water. So it's going to hang a little bit. It's not going to be straight up and down. So you're probably going to lose a couple of inches and it's going to hover, if I put it at 12 inches, it's probably going to be like 8 inches off the bottom. So I'll run this leader. I probably want, most of the time I want to run it at about, 16 inches. So we're going to bring this tag end up. I'm going to get it right to where I want it on the line. And then all you do, grab both ends of the line and then just pull. Not going anywhere. But they're expensive and I'm superstitious, so I always tie one overhand knot. It's not helping you in any way, but in my mind, feels like I'm not going to lose it, but because they're expensive, probably doesn't do anything, and you're good to cinch it. So then you clip off the excess off of that. And now we have our drop shot with our weight. So when you cast that out, and it's going to sit right here. Now for rigging, like I said, whatever you're going to use, if you're going to use a little, you know, a dinger or a little stick worm or a little full body tube type, hollow body tube, swim bait. Here's another common mistake for drop shotting. Run it under the base of the nose and bring it out through the nose. Bring it out through that little hole that they have. So it's like this. Don't run it straight through to the top of the head, or it's going to sit funny in the water. Like if it's up through that, it's most baits, it won't sit right. This, when you cast it out, so it's like this, but when this lands in the water, this is going to sit just like this in the water column, perfectly horizontal. You're not doing anything. You're tight line to it, and this tail is just going to be pulsated. So, you know, dead stick it for a minute or two. A lot of times, again, if you're casting into cover or brush pile, it's going to get hit on the drop. But you can work this now, and you know you're always going to be about 12 inches off the bottom. So I know exactly, you know, every cast of every pond I fish, I know don't run it here. You're going to run it into the log, run it on this side, and I'll just bounce this all the way in, just a very, very slowly pull your rod tip up. Because especially on really nice line like this fluoro. So this is expensive, high-end fluorocarbon, FC Sniper. I don't use it as a main line. You know, this 7-pound test, this will last me 5-10 years of leader lines. So I think it's like $30 for a spool of whatever it is, 200 yards. That's a lot. So I only use fluoro or expensive fluoro as leader lines. But watch how this thing jumps from flicking the line, how much action's in that. The one mistake that we see in drop shot fishing, don't work that rod so much. Every subtle tip movement in the water is like extrapolated. You know, it's exponentially more movement in the water on that line. So just very slow, you know, go from 3 o'clock to 12 o'clock and then let it settle, reel up your slack, do it again. And then you can work it all the way in. The bites on drop shot vary. Sometimes it's that subtle finesse bite. Other times your line will take off running. Other times you'll just get the bang, 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 and the fish is just, you know, hammering at the back of it. So, but this is an underutilized pond fishing technique. It's a way to suspend a bait because ultimately at the end of the day of fishing, all we're trying to do is mimic natural prey. Because you can go to any body of water and throw a minnow out under a bobber, you're going to catch fish. Most of these courses are tailored towards artificial fishing. But natural bait and a bobber, it's hard to beat that. So if you came on here looking for that next special perfect shiner, perfect live minnow to throw out, I don't have that. But being able to suspend natural prey bait. So again, this does a great job of mimicking the golden shiners in the ponds that I fish. But, you know, you can't go wrong with an olive, you know, green pumpkin or, you know, just a basic kind of, you know, subtle shad with a little bit of blue flakes in it. You know, anything that's like a bluegill coloration where you get the green pumpkin, but you have a little bit of that purple flake in it. If you ever held a sunfish in the sunlight, kind of like turkey feathers, they have that iridescent through the back. That's all purple sheen that runs through it. So, you know, green pumpkins mixed with either a red and black flake, which, you know, does this stimulate, you know, blood with the red when it flashes? I don't know, but there's just something about green pumpkin with red and black flake that just seems to work unanimously across clear water streams and ponds in this state. But, you know, blacks and blues, again, tried and true with largemouth bass. But keeping it, you know, pretty common. You might get a little flashy with like a, you know, a white with some flash. But again, just keep it natural because a drop shot allows you the opportunity to dead stick without being on the bottom. That's the problem with the Texas rig or a Carolina rig is you're maintaining contact with the bottom. Sometimes those fish just suspend, you know, a foot off the bottom and they're not, you know, it's not crawfish season. There's no terrestrials out. I'm not going to go bang the bottom for something that's going across, because that's not what I'm seeing as my natural prey base right now. But what you might see, especially in the winter months, the colder months or the dog days of summer, those fish retreat out to deeper water. They're holding tight to structure, and they're just looking for, one of those fish down in the thermocline to screw up and swim away from a school. And that's where drop shotting can be, invaluable for picking up fish when it's slow, utilizing a technique that isn't weightless. Because again, when you're throwing out these dingers, stick worms, whatever, it's so slow, it's so subtle. I enjoy it, but it's not for everybody, because finesse fishing can be tiresome when the bite is not there. So drop shot's just a great way to be able to dead stick up in the water column. You're not on the bottom, you're not on the top, you're not ripping something through. Fish are lethargic, they're tight to cover. Oh, I see a little minnow that just bounced right in front of my log. Gotcha. So that's a good technique. More fly fishing. I don't think there's a whole lot more than what we covered of streamers, woolly buggers, and maybe some top water. Work nymphs, work your transition areas. It's unlike trout fishing where you're trying to match the hatch, where there are subtle intricacies. Bass fishing's a lot less subtle. So really, if you're fly fishing, you're just looking to mimic bait fish, mimic natural colorations. That's the biggest thing. So it's a lot of strip fishing. If you want to throw something beneath the strike indicator, like a woolly bugger, and drop it 2 feet below, you could probably just bobber jig it. Quick strip, move the bobber, thing swings in the water, someone comes over and grabs it. But bass fishing with flies is not super technical. You're not worried about, did it land on the water funny? Am I moving it too fast? Am I doing, you're just trying to stimulate reactionary or predatory bite instincts by utilizing natural coloration patterns in something that mimics what they're used to seeing. So as we get into summer, that's going to be a lot more terrestrials. So poppers, hoppers, stimulators, ants, anything up on the top. And then year round, just being able to, cast a streamer or a woolly bugger in the general vicinity of where fish should be holding, where you would cast your more traditional baits to. All right, next box. Okay, so this is the brush hog box. So these can either be used as trailers, or they can be fished with an offset hook or a jig head. I'm kind of partial to these stinger jig heads because it's kind of an offset hook. I started using these a lot when I was rigging grubs or creature baits in rivers for smallmouth, because smallmouth just have a tendency to throw hooks, and the little backwards facing, kind of towards the eyelid, I just felt like it grabs that barb just a little bit better when it turns over than your traditional, jig head that looks like that, but then it's just a straight shank at the bottom with a turn that comes up. This gives you a little bit more of that room to bury that hook, maybe even double bury it, going through the lip and then drilling it back into the top side of the mouth. So brush hogs are a quintessential bass fishing plastic. They can be fished alone. So same deal. Again, they don't have sides. You obviously want to run it through the flat side, the non-armed side of the bait. So when you run it through, you don't want your hook point coming out with the arms. You want them, coming out perpendicular to your appendages. But same deal. You can rig this right through the nose, pull it up, weightless and weedless, let it fall. Same thing, just like with the stick worms, pop it. You can throw your, Texas rig, throw your bullet weight on top, run it across the bottom, maybe even quick run it through the middle of the water column, especially in, late May, early June. A lot of times, the mid-morning to mid-afternoon bite periods, like 10 o'clock to 11 o'clock, 2 o'clock to 3 o'clock, your non-traditional bite times that kind of heat up for bass for a few months out of the year, you might be able to just burn it through the middle of the water column and just using the weight to, have enough to cast it out and then, quick strip it in. Or you can work it up a jig head. Same deal. You could cast it out and straight retrieve it. You can bang it along the bottom, let it bounce. Or you can pair it as a trailer. Again, like I said, I don't do a lot of power fishing. in ponds. So you could run it as a trailer for a spinner bait or a buzz bait, run it up the hook shank. I'm partial to bladed jigs. I love a bladed jig. It's one of, outside of a few types of fish bites out there, smallmouth bass in streams, a big brown trout on a streamer, a largemouth bass crushing a bladed jig is one of, it's my top 3 of a bite. They just smoke they don't miss them. And you can work these a lot of different ways. Most people casting contact, throw this on a bait caster, flip it out there, steady retrieve in. You decide where you want it in the water column based on how heavy your jig head is and how fast you want to reel it in. I typically try to run these right over the top of cover and structure. So, if there's a grass mat, I want to retrieve it so it's the skirt's just barely touching the tip of those grass mats. Or if there's there's not a lot of vegetation for cover, it's more, hardwoods, rocks, things like that. Then I'm going to fish it more traditionally like a jig. I'm going to let it fall down to the bottom, and I'm going to go from, below 3 o'clock. I'm going to go from 6 o'clock on, I'm going to have that rod tip face right at the water, and then just a nice, big, slow pull up to, 10 o'clock behind me. And you'll feel it. It's going to, you'll feel that vibration. And then let it fall. But like, this isn't they typically don't grab it on the fall because it kind of looks funny when it falls back down, especially with this blade on it. It's not like a traditional jig that doesn't have that blade on it where this falls. Your line's attached to this. So you typically don't get bit on that fall, but it gets the fish's attention that it's something that's bouncing along the bottom. But you get that nice vibration, and boom. I mean, it will double over the rod, triple over the rod. You will never get a subtle bite on one of these. But all your assorted plastics, your baby brush hogs, every brand has a different terminology, but basically it's a creature bait with a lot of appendages. The more appendages, the better. Again, I'm partial to this type of coloration. Different brands, different names of baits. Bass Pro's brand for these Squirm and Squirts, this is what they consider green pumpkin. That is not universal for every brand. So some list them as watermelon. Some list green pumpkin that looks more like what I consider a watermelon. So I'm just always trying to get real close to that patternation that I get from, this Squirm and Squirt. But again, most of these are pretty tried and true. Your oranges, especially if you get up into the eastern part of the state, you get a lot of, more long ear that might be in pond pumpkin seeds. Then you're going to want more of that orange body with that flash through it. Maybe a darker green pumpkin, something like this. But, don't ever discredit June bug in June, lizards and brush hogs running a little bit more of a purple color. Something that's more of like a bluegill where it's got more of that purple and green flake in it. But brush hogs are great. They can be fished a lot of different ways. They're versatile. But most soft plastics, even tubes to some extent, if you buy a 5-inch tube, you could run that as a trailer. But your soft plastics are very versatile. You can Texas rig them, you can Carolina rig them, you can weightless, you can wacky rig them. You can serve them as a trailer. So you can never have too many different types of soft plastics when you're going, out to your favorite pond, because you're bound to find one. And that's the thing about ponds is you really find out what those fish want in, maybe even right now. I think we're probably still a little too close to the spawn that you're going to pick up a lot of fish on a lot of, things that we're not talking about on a chartreuse, or, you might get a largemouth that go after that on a drop shot. It's just that time of year. But when you start catching fish consistently in early March, in, early October, early mornings in July and August, that's your color. Once you figure that out in a pond, that's not going to change. Those fish have told you what it is that they look for at the times of year when they're not just fully immersed in spawning and gorging. So that's just a little deal to, you know, once you find a color, you can pretty much go to a pond with one tackle box that fits in your pocket. That's just how patterned these ponds, you know, small body of water. So you typically don't need a lot. But I will say this, don't mix plastics in boxes. So let me find an example of the drop shot box I had. The proprietary blends that they use, the chemicals that are in these things, put the same baits in with each other. Even if it's like, oh, these are the same style of bait, you know, same size, same exact brand, just different colors, they will melt together. It's just something about the chemical blends that don't, if you're not just going to leave them in a soft plastic bag in your backpack, in your pocket, if you decide to put them into a tackle box, don't you find a very expensive mistake one morning when you go out to your tackle box and you put too many of those in the same deals together. Saw some more question pop up. Do you paint your blades? If so, how do you paint your blades? I don't. You know, I think this one is a, you know, colored blade. It's got the green on it. I mean, I don't know. I Google waterproof paint. I mean, probably waterproof spray paint or acrylic, some type of, you could paint it on. I don't do it. But I'd imagine all it takes is a water-based, you know, water-resistant paint to put it on there. But, you know, you want that flash. You know, most of these, like some of these brighter colored bladed jigs, like the chartreuse one has a gold blade on it. You know, you can run this right here in open water for striper and hybrids. Again, you know, the bladed jig is very versatile. It can be fished a lot of different ways. So having something like this in your box that you can go run out, you know, you could bang this across the bottom and catch walleye and saugeye. But, you know, that little bit of flash that you get on it is important, especially on cloudy days. You get that just a little bit of flash. So if you're fishing super crystal clear water, that would be the only time that, you know, maybe having a darker colored blade would help with finicky fish. If they're not, you know, they're seeing that flash too often, but that's not something that I'm familiar with. What's that crawling on the wall behind you? Hopefully not a spider. I don't like spiders. Let's see, what else do we got here? Okay, swim baits, non-pre-molded swim baits. So we have flukes. So flukes are going to be your split tails. Most of them are hollow bodied, so they have the slit so that you can put weighted offset hooks in them. So if you ever seen a weighted offset hook and thought, you know, what are those? Well, that's the hiding place for them. So one quick tip for rigging them, instead of doing your traditional hook it through the nose, work it up for weedless, just slide this thing in there, go in through that slit, and then just work the hook point or the eye hole out the top. That's going to save you a lot of hassle. If you try to run that big weight through the body of something, you're just going to ruin the bait. So that'll just pop up and, you know, get it up like that, get that through it, and then you just rig it how you would anything else, putting that hook point through the center of the body, bring it out the back, and then, you know, make it weedless, and it'll kind of sits like that. So just on the bottom, you know, some of these aren't very big flukes. These are, you know, 4-inch, 5-inch flukes, but some of the bigger ones that have real deep bodies on them, you can actually hide, like, so these ones, that's what's in this. But that deeper body, you know, hides the whole profile. So I don't use a whole lot of these in ponds. If I use anything, it's going to be jointed swim baits. So like a Magic Shad or something where I got the joints on it. And again, I just rig these weedless and weightless. These are great for picking up pre-spawn lunkers. If you can cast it in front of a big one's nose, you're going to get bit more often than not just on the fall, which is another great thing about going weedless and weightless is you just cast that out and this just looks like a dying fish. It holds like this in the water and all those joints are pulsating. So I just fish it like a dead fish, cast it out there, let it fall. If I don't get bit on that, you know, initial fall, one quick rod pop, you know, if you've ever seen a dying fish in the water, especially like a shad or something, they kind of do those upward darts, and then, you know, they kind of pulsating down and upward dart before they finally get eaten or just die completely. So that's all you're trying to do with this. Just a quick rip up, and then it flutters back down. Quick rip up, flutters back down. And again, it's a tight line bite. You typically don't get the double over unless they smack it when you're in the middle of flipping it up. That typically doesn't happen. They typically hit it when it's on the fall. So again, you're just looking for your line to get tight, or you see any subtle, you know, tension that you can notice on the rod tip, you know, then hammer down that hook. But if I'm not using a pre-molded swim bait to, you know, pretty quickly burn across, you can get it again in the summertime. Sometimes those bass, they'll push around the fry, especially after the bluegill have spawned. There'll be these big pockets of bluegill fry all over your pond, and you'll get 5, 6, 7, you know, decent sized 2 to 5 pound bass that kind of group up together, and they push that bait right up onto the bank. And then, you know, they take their turns getting after them. And that's where a pre-molded swim bait, burning it through that, you can pick up a lot of bites. But typically, if I'm going to use a swim bait that isn't pre-molded for that particular purpose, it's just going to be a jointed swim bait, just as a different option for, you know, fishing weightless and weedless with stickworms, or a brush hog or something like that. So always good to have a few in the box. I've had success with most colors, but again, natural colorations, shad, green, pumpkin, red. But like all of these, they can all be fished the same way. So you could run them onto a jig head, work the whole body of the bait up onto the hook shank. You could fish them, you know, weightless and weedless, or go ahead and Texas rig it. It's all about what your preference, your style of fishing is, how you like to get bit. You know, there's going to be different bites. Like I said, on a slow day, finesse fishing, it can be frustrating because it's just a lot of nothing. You know, if you're just out there filtering water with, you know, crankbaits or whatever, at least you're actively doing something. You know, you're reeling, when you're finesse fishing, it's a lot of slack line. And when you're not getting bit, it's rough, but you can utilize all these different plastic baits in, you know, a number of different ways, whether it's your drop shot, whether it's a Carolina rig, whether it's, you know, Texas rig, whether it's weedless or wacky rigged. You run a piece of split shot instead of, you know, if a bullet weight's too much, maybe you just want to really slowly crank it, but you want to keep it down in the water column. Just one piece of split shot instead of a, you know, 1/4 ounce, 1/8 ounce, 3/16, 3/8 bullet weight accomplishes the same thing. Again, if you take anything away from any of these courses, the primary objective is mimic with artificial natural prey in that body of water. And that's all we're trying to do. So we went through, I guess we didn't really touch on the jigs. So your basic non-bladed jigs, you know, these are, I guess I could hold it up, right? So there's some jigs that are in there, you know, again, pretty natural colors. Got a couple that have a little bit of chartreuse through them, you know, black and blue, this kind of black and red with a little bit of chartreuse. If you're in super stained water, muddy water, you might elect to have a little bit of flash on it. That's for ponds. You know, most of our ponds are fairly similar throughout the state. Obviously, if you have better aeration, better vegetation, it's probably going to be cleaner and clearer. But kind of general principles that you can follow when you're fishing, like if you just base colors, what do I need to use? If you're in clear water, like you can see the bottom at the bank clear, and you can see out, you know, 10, 15 feet. You want natural colors. You want dark olives, green pumpkins, watermelons, blacks, blues. You get into more of kind of a dingy water where you have a clean, clear pond for most of the year, but you got some rain that came in, you know, you have pretty good drainage, but there's a little bit of runoff, and it doesn't turn it red. It just turns it kind of that, you know, puddle color. You know, you see a small mud puddle, that's kind of what it looks like. You're like, it's clear, but it's got a bunch of just kind of particles moving through it. That's when you're looking for your whites, your chartreuses, those bright flashy colors, but paired with a natural base. It's just going to give you that little bit extra for the days where those fish are, having to use, the other senses more. So they're using that lateral line system to find where that stimulation is at. But once they get to it, they still need to be able to see it to be able to inhale it. So having just that little bit of flash can pick up those extra bites. Now, if you're in completely clay stained mud water, whites and reds, either match the color or go the exact opposite. Again, if you've ever, and why white? If you've ever fished a pond, over time, and it's typically clear or mostly clear, you're going to notice that your fish are pretty vibrant. They're going to have, your bass are going to have nice dark green backs. They're probably going to have a lot of speckling through that lateral line system, those big black horizontal bands. Your bluegills are going to, those males are going to have that really bright red breast on them. And it's just because they're absorbing sunlight. So when you get that mud on there, you get that clay stained water, super thick particles in the water, no light penetration. Literally within a couple of days, you will pull a fish out and it will look like a ghost. Just completely devoid of color. White largemouth bass. You can kind of see that the coloration's there, but it happens really quickly. So either match the color with red, especially for year-round stained ponds. A lot of your species, especially your crustaceans or any insects that may live in the water, they're probably going to take on a lot of that red color. But if you're using bait fish patterns or something like that, go with whites. Not flashy whites, not a lot of sparkle, just plain solid pearl white. And you're going to get bit with that. So those are kind of rules of thumb to go with for water color that can help you pick up some extra fish anytime you go fishing. Swim baits. Okay, I've got a couple more soft plastic boxes here. So these ones now are kind of coming into play because we're about to start some spawning activity. So spawning activity for largemouth bass in your pond. Again, most of those fish, especially the early spawners, because not all your fish are going to spawn the same day, same time. It's going to take place over the course of 3 or 4 weeks. Each fish is different. So the early spawners are probably going to be on the north side, especially if you have a dam on the north side of the pond. Easy transition from deep to shallow water, wind driven out of the south, warm water displacement on the top, good aeration coming, especially if you have riprap to help with water clarity and erosion. So that water is going to be clean. For the most part, it's going to bang up against the rocks, going to keep those aerated. So right now, today, probably focus your efforts for largemouth on the northern ends. The ones, if you have any deep water on the southern end of your pond, those are the fish that are lagging behind. They're still kind of coming out of that winter lull, metabolisms readjusting, things like that. So focus your efforts on the northern ends. Those are going to be your first fish to spawn. So what we're trying to accomplish with spawning fish, because the males build the nests and the females wait. It's pretty cool in ponds to watch spawning activity. It's not something that you typically have an opportunity to see when you're on, big water, moving around a bunch. If you have a small, less than 2 acre pond that you can walk around, it's pretty fun to watch them. Just watching the song and dance, how they do, the male building the bed, the female watching, all the other fish that are swimming around, disrupting. It's a pretty cool scene. So your male is going to be aggressive. If you have one big female fish that is sitting near that bed, she's getting ready to drop her eggs. She's waiting for that perfect time. She's just sitting there and you're like, man, that 6, 7, 8 pound bass, I've got to catch that and get a picture of it. You might sit there all day long and catch that male fish 24 times. You throw him right back in the water, goes right back on the bed doing circles. Cast it back out, comes and gets it again. So there's no rhyme or reason to catching those big females when they get close to their beds. Sometimes it's a swim bait. Sometimes it's just something falling in front of them. But males are fun to catch. And especially if you have a good, healthy population of largemouth in your pond, you're going to have some males that are going to be 4 and 5 pounds. So you're still going to get into some, bigger quality fish. But typically you're going to average like 1 to 3 pounds. And those are fun all day long on light, spinning gear. Light bait casting gear. It's fun to go out and catch 100 fish in a day over the course of a couple hours. So bright, obnoxious colors. They're trying to build their bed, protect their bed. So your very classic ribbed worm. One of these is kind of more of a green pumpkin. The other one's black, but chartreuse tail. Again, you can rig it any way that we've shown. You're just trying to run it, near the bed. The one thing I would say for if you are targeting fish and they are on their beds, don't drag stuff through their bed. You can catch them without ruining, what they're doing, especially in a pond. And if it's your own pond, that's it's your next generation of fish. So not spooking them out. You can catch that female, put her right back in the water. She's going to go do her thing. Same thing with the male. So again, it's kind of that give and take of, I really want to catch this fish, but I've caught this male 100 times and he might die of exhaustion from getting caught that many times. Will another male come in? Yeah. But you want to take care of your brooder female fish in your pond. So don't run stuff, don't Carolina rig or Texas rig. Don't run it straight through the bed. That bass is going to come grab it if it's anywhere around it. So get up in the water column. If you're running a Texas rig, flip that lizard or that worm, something, go right along perpendicular with the bed, go around it, go to the outside. Oftentimes if you see a male near the bed, if you can't see that he's kind of sitting there protecting eggs or fry, then they haven't gone yet. So that deep drop that's probably pretty near where that bed's at, there's going to be a female or two that you can't see them, but they're sitting out there. So flipping away from the beds in the general vicinity is probably going to pick you up more fish than going directly at the bed. But trick worms, good old red worm, green pumpkin, red and black flake. You might elect for, maybe a June bug, a purple worm, another stick worm, red and black, something like that. This box is typically pretty effective at this time of year, especially as they start to get up near their beds. Again, I'm a pretty big advocate of weightless and weedless, so I'm just going with an offset hook like this, or I'm going to wacky rig it. But again, all the options are open. Jig heads, bullet weights, Carolina rigs, anything like that. So your next one, which again, your later spawners, the ones that are going to happen towards the end of April, more terrestrial, warmer days, longer days, a lot more terrestrial activity. That's where you can get into your lizards. So, nice box of lizards. Again, lizards are probably the only one, because I actually want to swim them through the water, that I will put on a small bullet weight, but all I'm doing is casting and retrieving, just a real slow, steady retrieve, and then running these down the banks. Those fish, after they spawn, each fish is going to be different, but you're going to get a little bit of a lull. They're going to go out into the deeper water, those transition areas, rest and feed. They're probably only looking for one meal a day. It's going to be very similar to early pre-spawn activity. So late January, early February, that's how the bite's going to be for, depending on your pond, depending on the fish. I mean, it could be a couple of days, it could be a couple of weeks, but eventually a lot of those fish are they're then going to transition into their early summer pattern homes, which is a lot of times going to be fallen cover. If there's big trees that have fallen in where a fish can move up and down throughout the day, if you have a dock on your pond with a lot of vegetative cover with a pretty good drop going out, all those fish are looking for is areas of rapid depth change. And if there's cover that can protect it all, those fish are going to hover to it, because throughout the course of the day, they can move up to feed, they can move out to rest, move up to feed, out to rest in a very small window. It might only be 15, 20 feet, but there's enough depth change and structure change and different types of cover that if you can find those locations, that's where your fish are going to be, a couple weeks after the spawn. And they're kind of looking for anything at that point. So lizards are in play, swimming worms pretty quickly are going to be in play. But again, like I said, I'm just partial to using, small tubes, small stick worms, weightless, weedless, wacky rig, just my style. But all those different types of baits, that's the type of habitat you're looking for after the spawn. Anything with rapid depth change, with lots of cover, lots of shade, that's going to attract the majority of your bass in the pond. Now, the early morning hours and the late evening hours, those fish are going to come out of that and they're probably going to run the banks. So that's where running a bladed jig, Texas rigged lizard, Texas rigged worm, pre-molded swim bait, a swim bait on a jig head, a swim bait with a bullet weight. Those, the hour around dusk and the hour around dawn, you can really start to exploit the shallows. And as the water temperatures creep into the mid 70s, that's when we start getting into our top water action, which you can maybe get a little bit of it during the spawn. If fish are up near the beds, you might be able to pull something on the surface, whether it be a buzz bait, a jitterbug, something to disrupt the surface where maybe they think that there's a predator or something disruptive that could come down from above. They might go up and get it. But typically your top water kind of starts in Oklahoma once that water temperature hits about 72, 75 degrees. So about 10 degrees above when they start thinking, they're going to be spawning, 62 to 65 degrees. So I like hollow bodied frogs. If I'm fishing top water in ponds, that's kind of my go-to top water. Versatile. I can throw this up or on anything and it doesn't get hung up. Mostly bullfrogs around. So your American bullfrog's going to have that, green color with kind of the yellow orangey underbelly, or again, something black. If you can get a frog that's black and blue, so if it has maybe like a little lighter coloration, but it's black on the top and it's kind of got black and blue legs going for it, that moved very slowly. You're just turning one reel crank maybe just to make it kind of just subtly disrupt. It's not mimicking a frog. It's mimicking a bluegill. If you ever watch bluegill in the summer, things will, berries and stuff will fall out of trees. Bugs will land on the water. Those sunfish hang higher up in the water column, and you'll kind of see them, maybe even the tail fin or the dorsal fin will just kind of come out of the water. But a hollow body frog that's black and blue, if you pitch it up underneath docks, if you pitch it underneath, overhanging cover that provides shade, you can pick up a lot of bass on that coloration, not because they think it's a frog, but because it looks strikingly similar to how bluegills sit at that time of year when they're up in the water column. Otherwise, a dark color with some green, green, something, maybe for the smaller frogs, the little brown ones that you see hopping around with that light yellow, just something like this. But I like a hollow bodied frog. You're not going to get snagged up. The only thing about hollow bodied frogs is the hookup is fairly difficult. It's not an easy, it hammered it hook set. Sometimes they hit it funny and it doesn't, compress this so that you can get the hook set. Sometimes you're too slow. Most of the times you're way too fast. Most topwater bites are missed because you weren't let that fish grab it, turn, and go back under. Whoever was asking the fly fishing questions earlier, that you ever dry fly fished in the summer out west for cutthroat trout, especially, who, they're wet hot dogs coming up to the top of the water. You're always way too fast. You see that fish come up, they don't quite have it yet. And, your reaction is to just slow down. And it's almost impossible. It's impossible to talk yourself because you're just so anticipated of seeing the visual strike of coming up. That's the fun in topwater. You visually get to see the fish take what you're offering. So your heart rate picks up the second that fish comes up, and you go and try your best to just let the fish grab it, turn, and when you see it go back underwater, then hammer that hook home, especially with these hollow-bodied frogs. Now, if you're using something like a little rattle frog that's got some trebles on it, they typically hook themselves. If they come up and grab this, there's just too many hook points there for them to get away. But you can't run this too close to like grass mats or, any woody structure because it gets snagged up. So kind of the catch-22, it's like you sacrifice the hook points so that you can fish more bassy areas that have lots and lots of cover and structure. But at the same time, it also makes it additionally hard to set the hook, especially some of these with these weird legs on them that when you swim them, they kind of go out like this and come back in. But again, those hook points are right off to the sides. So unless they get that and flush it and get those hook points pointed out, sometimes it's not even your fault. Sometimes the fish grabbed it and it didn't make it to where you could actually set the hook. You just pull all of it right back out. But those are my top water options. Again, I see a lot of people use buzz baits. I've caught fish using buzz baits. I've caught fish using like walking dogs that have rattle balls and stuff like that in them. I've caught them on, chugging plugs. But overall, quiet, subtle pond fishing. Lots of, but you just want those subtle vibrations. So, a rattle frog that's barely moving in the water, maybe like a Zara puppy that you're just, like a black one, or a jitterbug, just something that you can move very slowly, not a lot of noise. You go throw that buzz bait and burn it across. I mean, you can hear it from the next neighborhood over. And sometimes it gets you, it gets a fun, big, exciting strike. But if you're trying to catch just sheer numbers, more fish, get more strikes, you're going to have more success in ponds fishing natural colors on a very slow presentation, without making a lot of noise. So that kind of brings it through everything that I had to show today. So does anybody have any follow-up questions for where we're at? This will be posted. This will be live on our website. The link that I sent you guys with the link to this also included the link for the archive with where all of our videos are housed. If you subscribe to our YouTube channel, Outdoor Oklahoma, it's a playlist. It's called Ask an Angler. So they're all there. So there's 3 or 4 different options for you to be able to find these videos after we're done. But I don't have any new information to share. So typically what we do at this time, I can see how many people are viewing at this time. So if you've heard everything, if you've got it all, we just ask that you hop off. And then once I get down to 0 people in here, I'll go ahead and end the stream, and then it's live. And if you want to come back and look at it later, tomorrow or next week, oh man, there's 10 more minutes on it, he was answered. You can just, scroll through to the end if I answered any questions. So that's what we got now. So I'll give it a minute or so to ask questions. If you're done, go ahead and hop off. And if I don't have any questions here in the next, minute or so, I'll go ahead and end the stream. But thanks y'all for being here. It's a great time of year right now. Weather's good. Get out and go fish. Fishing can't be any better than it is right now. Unfortunately, we got a little bit of the north wind this week, but highs are still in the 60s. Overnight lows are, mid 40s. So not going to do too much damage. Your crappie are probably in spawning mode right now. Your largemouth bass are probably picking up day by day. Sunfish are getting there. They're going to start pushing into those shallows pretty soon. But we're right in it. We're in peak time. The next 4 to 6 weeks on your ponds is going to be the best fishing that you get all year, probably size wise, quantity wise, number of strikes per cast wise. If you have good populations of fish of any size in the ponds that you fish, everything that we just went through today, one of those baits, and more than likely one of these smaller baits, a little stick bug, a little tube, you're gonna roll through so many different types of fish, which is fun. I love fishing as small as possible in ponds because I've caught 6-7 pound bass on a 1/32 ounce, 1.5 inch tube. It happens. It's fun. Can't usually hang on to them with the microlight, but it's fun in the winter times. But you never know what that next fish is going to be. Every bite could be a 4-inch sunfish, a 4-pound bass, a 14-inch crappie, and like I said, if you have a healthy population of channel cats, in that 1 to 2 pound range, these little tubes will crush those catfish as well. But if you only have a few catfish and they're all relatively bigger, you're going to want to stick to bait fishing, here in the next, month or so in the dusk hours. You can pick them up in the middle of the day again, but you're going to be fighting with turtles. Any offering you throw out there in the middle of the day, 9 times out of 10, turtles get to it before a fish will. All right. Well, I haven't seen any more questions come up, so I'm going to go ahead and end the stream. My contact information, our fishing resources webpage, it was obviously on the email that I sent. Feel free to reach out whenever. Text, call, email. If you call during the week, typically I call people back in the evenings. You're off work, it's easier to talk fishing. Email or text, you're going to get a pretty rapid response, even if it's the weekend. But if you have anything to share, if you're out there catching fish, be sure to share them at the dock. Go to wildlifedepartment.com, click on the dock square that's right there on the main page. You can look at all the fish that are being caught around the state, and you can share your photos there. There's no size restrictions, no limits. We just want to see fish. So our fishing resources page at wildlifedepartment.com it's constantly being updated with relevant seasonal information. So there's the spring fishing tips on there for a lot of other species: walleye, white bass, blue cats, flatheads. But other than that, let me know if there's anything that I can do as the state's fishing coordinator to help you fish or find a place to fish, or you ever just want to talk shop. That's what I'm here for. We do these courses for you guys. So hopefully you came away with something today that maybe will help you catch fish in the future. But that's about all we got. So how do we get your info? If you go to wildlifedepartment.com, click on the fishing resources page. My contact information's at the bottom. If you were on the email for this link, when you clicked in to get here, my information's at the bottom of that email. But outside of that, I appreciate everybody coming. Stay safe. It's been a rough year, but it's always fun in the spring. Takes your mind off everything else that's going on. Take somebody new fishing this spring. Take a kid. It's up to all of us to make sure that the next generation enjoys the same things that we love to do. So this is the perfect time of year to take your neighbor, take your friend, take somebody who hasn't been fishing before. This is the best time of year to do it. You're never going to have better fishing than you will for the next 6 weeks. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and end it. Y'all take care, tight lines, and we'll see you next time.